Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to literary archaeologist and author Kevin Avery. He's here to talk about not one, but two books for which he is responsible: Everything is an Afterthought, The Life and Writings of Paul Nelson, and Conversations with Clint, Paul Nelson's Lost Interviews with Clint Eastwood, 1979 to 1983. Stick around, and if you die during this show, be warned that Avery has first dibs on your unpublished work. I completely get Kevin Avery, I think. Growing up, he admired the writing and reviews of a longtime Rolling Stone journalist named Paul Nelson. He even wrote a fan letter to the magazine about Nelson. It was published in the April 30th, 1981 issue. Go ahead, look it up. Personally, while I was a regular reader of Rolling Stone in those days, Nelson's name and work didn't have quite the same impression upon me. In fact, I didn't remember it at all. And, sadly for Avery and other Nelson fans, the legendary writer eventually faded away, a victim of his own inner demons and compulsions. But Avery never forgot him. And when he relocated from Salt Lake City to Brooklyn in February 2006, Avery sent his idol a note suggesting they work together to compile a best-of collection of Nelson's work. Nelson never responded directly. I'll let Avery tell you what happened in a moment. But it won't spoil the suspense to say that Avery is the author/editor of two new Nelson books: Everything is an Afterthought, The Life and Writings of Paul Nelson, and Conversations with Clint, Paul Nelson's Lost Interviews with Clint Eastwood, 1979 to 1983. There is a truly compelling story here, whether you're interested in pop music, film, or the mysteries of the writing life. And everything has a genuine bonus. The foreword is by my own literary idol, Nick Tosches. Now, just a note about this particular interview. I had some technical problems, and for some reason, only Kevin's answers recorded, none of my questions, which will probably make some people in the audience very happy. But, so the editing, I've had to work a little bit with the editing, and it's a little different than most interviews where there's give and take. Mostly you're going to hear Kevin talk about Paul Nelson, and Kevin talk about Clint Eastwood. Just be warned. Kevin Avery, welcome to Mr. Media. I told a little of the story of how you came to produce the Paul Nelson biography and collection, Everything is an Afterthought, but I'm sure our viewers and listeners would enjoy hearing the complete version.
Well, when I moved back here, at the end of 2005, I moved back here to get married, and I also wanted to pursue my writing career. And it seemed like a great way to start would be to reach out to Paul Nelson, who had been, like you said, one of my literary idols. And because I found out that, he wasn't writing anymore. He'd spent the last 14 or so years working in a video shop in Greenwich Village. And so I wrote him a letter and proposed that we work together and anthologize some of his best work. And I never heard back from him. And so the months passed, and in July of 2006, I received a phone call from a gentleman named Michael Seidenberg, who identified himself as a good friend of Paul Nelson's. And he said, "I'm not sure if you heard the news, but Paul Nelson died last week." And he said, "The reason I'm calling you is I really wanted you to know that Paul had indeed received your letter. He was very touched by it, that anybody remembered him. And it was a project that he indeed wanted to do. He just physically and mentally was in no shape to do it." And so that was really the day that I began writing Everything is an Afterthought. I took that as my signal that this was a project that I needed to do. Even at that, it wasn't until several months later, in January of 2007, when Paul's son Mark came to New York to collect his father's belongings. The medical examiner had sealed Paul's apartment after he died because nobody had identified the body. When Mark came to collect his dad's belongings, he called me and he says, "Come on, I think you should come over. There's something here you'll want to see." And Paul, in his later last year especially, had terrible trouble with his short-term memory. He wrote himself a lot of post-it notes, and some of them which are just heartbreaking. Some of them are as simple as saying, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, I need to eat. And but there was a half dozen or so post-it notes around the apartment that had my name on it, or my phone number. Notes like, call the book guy, let's meet. And so if there was any doubt before, which there really wasn't, but that confirmed for me that this was a project that I really needed to do. And as I learned more about Paul, it quickly grew from just being an anthology of his best works to also being his biography, because as I found out, he had a fascinating life. Yeah, my wife and I have often talked about if Paul had answered that initial letter and we had worked together, what kind of book would have come out as a result. Certainly it wouldn't have been the same book for a couple of reasons. I think Paul, being a very private man, certainly would not have revealed a lot of what I found out to me. He did. He really closed, in the course of his life, he closed several doors. But that last 14 or 15 years, he closed doors on pretty much everybody who had been his friends in New York, writers, people in the rock music community. But by the same token, he was doing what he wanted. He didn't want to write anymore. Writing was always, very much a chore for him. He didn't enjoy writing, as fantastic as a writer as he was. But he did love movies, and so initially it seemed like working in a video shop would be a great way to wind down the years. But his last couple of years especially were very tragic, with health problems and money problems, and so yeah, there were certainly times writing the book it was difficult. Yeah, well, it was a combination of reading some of what he had written, and I also had the opportunity to listen to a lot of his interview tapes. And Paul's interview style was very conversational. He would reveal, he would draw out his interviewees by talking about himself, and especially when he would talk about how difficult it is to write. And what a challenge it was for him. Yeah, there were certain times you start agreeing with him, and I think the hardest part was just learning about all of these great projects that he embarked on that for one reason or another he didn't finish. One being the Clint Eastwood interviews for Rolling Stone, another being a book of Ross MacDonald interviews, a biography of Neil Young, and it was you could hear in his voice the disappointment that he couldn't do these projects, but he did become eventually afflicted with just a writer's block that was almost akin to paralysis.
As I mentioned, and you and I have discussed off the air, I'm a big fan of Tosches, and even got to spend a day interviewing him in Greenwich Village early in my career in the 80s. I always enjoyed how Tosches connects himself to the people he writes about, something I try to do with Mr. Media at times. What made you connect to Paul Nelson's work?
It was just the beauty of the language, first of all. It was a cross between F. Scott Fitzgerald and Dashiell Hammett. He loved hard-boiled detective fiction. It was that, and it was, you just felt how important it was for him that you understood why he admired this particular album or this particular movie. And the way he would do it was, it was a feeling of, I'm sharing this with you. And it just captured my imagination. I mean, back in the 70s, I'm sure I read all the same guys you did, Dave Marsh and Greil Marcus and Jay Cox and and all of these guys. But Paul's writing, I would find myself going back to and rereading, and it was just great writing.
What went wrong in Nelson's life that he ended up the way he did? Was anyone to blame besides Nelson himself?
I don't know about that. I think what happened with some of the projects that he couldn't complete is he says this himself in an interview with Suzanne Vega. He says, I just had so much I wanted to say, and he just wasn't able to find the words. One thing that he would do is, for Paul, it was never a simple interview. It was never, go in and interview somebody for an hour and go home and write the piece. He would always expect his interviews to go on for days. And, indeed, the Eastwood interviews went on for years. And the Ross McDonald interviews, there's over 40 hours worth of tapes there. And I think sometimes just faced with that much material to deal with and faced with, like you said, he admired some of these people so much. It was kind of a matter of how do I do them justice?
There are several big, bold print names in the Nelson life story. Bob Dylan, Warren Zevon, Clint Eastwood, Ross McDonald. Let's talk about them. Bob Dylan.
Paul attended the University of Minnesota at the same time a guy named Bobby Zimmerman did. And Bobby Zimmerman went on to become Bob Dylan. And at that time, Paul and his best friend John Pancake were editing a homegrown journal called the Little Sandy Review, which was dedicated to reviewing serious traditional folk music. And that came to Bob Dylan's attention, and they certainly met and had some encounters. And at one point, Dylan, knowing that Paul and John, who lived in the same boarding house, were going to be away for the weekend, Dylan came over one weekend and helped himself to about 25 of their best folk albums. And, that was the beginning of Paul's lifelong relationship with Dylan. And he reviewed him many times. And some of Paul's most glowing reviews are for Dylan's work. But by the same token, some of Paul's most damning reviews are of Dylan's work. It is. And, one thing, Paul was probably one of the few folk music critics who embraced Dylan when he went electric. In fact, when that happened, Paul was managing editor of Sing Out magazine, which was, the notable folk magazine of the times. And Paul wrote a rave review that doubled pretty much as his resignation letter from Sing Out, because he knew that this was going to be controversial. And as Paul said, when Dylan went electric, so did he. And Dylan always remembered that Paul wrote that review, and for many years thereafter, Paul says he got his share of free concert tickets. But more than that, Dylan always respected what Paul wrote, and more than once reached out to Paul, wanting his opinion on something that he had done. So.
What about Warren Zevon?
It developed right after Warren released his first album and performed in New York, and Paul went up to the Zevon's, he was then married to Crystal Zevon, went up to their hotel room the next day, I believe, and there was an instant friendship. They just all hit it off, and that friendship lasted for several years and is probably best documented in Paul's Rolling Stone cover story, Warren Zevon, How He Saved Himself from a Coward's Death, which details in just tragically Zevon's battle with alcoholism. It's also where, for the first time, it's revealed that Paul and Zevon are good friends, even though, Paul had written about Zevon a couple of times by then. Paul even found himself participating in Warren's intervention. Like I say, the friendship went on for a few years, and then it ended up disintegrating when Paul wrote a bad review of one of Warren's good friends, J.D. Southey. Well, it depended. Certain writers certainly adhered to the philosophy that you shouldn't get too close to the people you write about. In the case of Paul, he never really saw that as a conflict of interest. If faced with the fact that he had to give one of these people who he admired a bad review, he did it. But and as several people pointed out, if Paul was not a close friend of Zevon's, the cover story about Zevon's alcoholism would never have gotten written. And it's just, if anybody who's read it, it's one of those pieces of rock journalism that you never forget. There you get into the debate of how much power do critics and reviews really have in terms of sales. Paul did give Excitable Boy just a rave review in Rolling Stone, and I'm sure brought that to a lot of people's attention who wouldn't have otherwise known. So yeah, I think you're hard pressed to find a true Warren Zevon fan who doesn't also know who Paul Nelson is. And that was, they became instant friends when they met. But one thing that absolutely solidified their friendship was Paul happened to mention, this was in, I believe, the spring of 1976. He happened to mention that in a few weeks, I guess it was the summer of '76, he was heading to Santa Barbara, California, where he was going to interview Ross MacDonald. And come to find out, Warren and Crystal Zevon had read every Ross MacDonald book cover to cover. And they were diehard MacDonald fans. And Paul even ended up inviting them to attend one of the interview sessions in Santa Barbara. It's strange. 20 years ago or so, Ross MacDonald was selling in the, millions. But ironically, I've just heard that Warner Brothers has bought the rights to all of those books and has plans to actually start a Lou Archer, Ross MacDonald's private detective Lou Archer, a franchise based on those books, beginning with the Moving Target, I believe. Oh no, either that or the Galton case, one or the other. Yeah, well, I mean, in the case of, in the case of Paul, well, what I just found unthinkable was the fact that as much as I loved his work, there was not a volume of his work that I could, pick up off the shelf and read when I wanted to enjoy it. That was, the main reason I did everything as an afterthought. By the same token, if bringing these interviews with MacDonald to light could help bring another audience, another generation to MacDonald's work, all the better, because, they're great books.
And no matter how many times Nelson let him down, Eastwood almost always gave him another chance to get it right. That's not what I would have expected of Dirty Harry,
Yeah, I mean, it all started back in '72 when Paul was probably the only critic in a major publication, mainstream publication, to give Dirty Harry a rave review. Paul thought it was a great film, and actually in the course of that review, makes a comment that in his mind, in the coming decades, Eastwood is going to be a major figure to be reckoned with, both in acting and directing. Boy, he was dead on with that. A few years later, in '79, he talked his higher ups at Rolling Stone into let's do an interview, cover story interview with Clint Eastwood. So he flew out to Boise, Idaho, where Clint was filming Bronco Billy with Scatman Crothers and Sandra Locke, and Paul proceeds to interview Clint, and lo and behold, they get along great. They're just kindred spirits, and you listen to the tapes and you can just hear how much these guys liked each other. So Paul goes back to New York, but he does not lo and behold, write the piece. He's having some writer's block. Uh, about a year later, Clint's making another movie, and somebody from Rolling Stone wants to go out and interview Clint. And long story short, Paul goes out again. Well, this goes on through basically 1983, and Eastwood each time lets Paul come back, and I think for a couple of reasons. I think he enjoyed Paul's company. It when I first heard the tapes, as interesting as they were, and they really were just fascinating. It was not a Clint Eastwood that I thought I knew. The one thing that was just very apparent was these guys just really enjoyed hanging around together. And so this went on through 83, and ultimately nothing was ever done with those tapes. In fact, Paul continued interviewing Eastwood even after he quit work, after Paul quit work at Rolling Stone. And so for years there was always talk of what do you ever think happened to those Eastwood tapes? And sure enough, Paul still had them in his apartment. Where they really, they were very like in some ways. I understand what you're saying, but they both were no nonsense. They were pretty straight shooters, no pun intended. They both liked movies. One of my favorite chapters of the book is just Paul and Clint talking about other people's movies. And it's you hear Eastwood talking about his favorite Kurosawa film, or his favorite Bergman film, his favorite Fellini film, as well as other contemporary films of the time, talking about Spielberg's movies and Brian De Palma. They both were big lovers of jazz. Paul, though he was famous as a rock critic, loved jazz music. So they just got along really well together. Well, that was the one thing that really surprised me about the interviews is, very early on in them, Paul would ask Eastwood a question, and 5 minutes later, Eastwood's still talking, and very, very eloquently in some cases. So it was eye-opening. But what's nice is it's at a time when he really was still making that transition from acting to directing. He was doing all of these very low-budget, kind of rough around the edges movies. He was learning his craft, and so especially if you're familiar with Eastwood today, it's really kind of enjoyable to compare the Clint of today with the Clint back then, and you realize that much of what he's accomplished has been very much by design.
Nelson worked for Rolling Stone for many years. What did Jan Wenner think of him?
Yeah, actually, Jan has been, both books were done with Jan's blessing. He has been was very helpful because so much of Paul's work was done at Rolling Stone. So he was very helpful in terms of, working with me to, get that book put together. But I had the opportunity when I was researching the first book to visit Jan at his office in Rolling Stone, and he had respect for Paul. You really got the feeling that he wished it had turned out different. I mean, he had his vision for how he thought the record review section should be, and Paul was the record review editor, and he had pretty much staked that out as his domain. And Paul liked writing very long, very deep reviews of albums that sometimes would go on thousands of words. Jan wanted the record reviews to get down smaller and smaller and smaller. He wanted, X amount of lines, and he wanted to reflect more of what the marketplace was about. And that's the last thing Paul cared about. When he was very excited by punk rock when it came along, so he championed the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, and gave his writers the opportunity to write about these bands. And he and Jan just did not see eye to eye on that. So when I interviewed him, I definitely got a sense of regret that it hadn't turned out differently.
For more original interviews, surf over to our main website, mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. If you've enjoyed today's show, subscribe for free to Mr. Media via email, RSS, or iTunes, and you'll never miss a show. Another good idea, download our new free Mr. Media mobile app in the Android market. You can also listen with a piece of string and a tin can in many parts of the internet. Show your support of Mr. Media by supporting our sponsors, including Audible. To download your free audiobook today, go to audibletrial.com/radio. Again, that's audibletrial.com/radio for your free audiobook. We're also supported by the partyauthority.us. Call DJ Ira for all your party entertainment needs nationwide at 1-800-DIAL-DJs, or visit their website, thepartyauthority.us. If you've got an idea for a guest, a comment on today's show, or would like to advertise on Mr. Media Radio, email me directly at bob@mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. You can also call our 24-hour listener line at 1-727-498-4711. Some messages may be used in an upcoming show, and unless you live next door to Mr. Media, there may be a toll charge. You can also follow Mr. Media on Facebook, Twitter, or our new YouTube and Vimeo video channels. Thanks so much for joining us today. I always appreciate you sharing a piece of your day with Mr. Media. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.
Okay, I just spent about 20 minutes with this guy by the name of Mr. Media. Mr. Media, come on. I'm Miss Media. 28 years, babe. Mr. Media. He's on a little screen on Skype. You know, what is that? He's cute, though. I'm glad I get to finally see his face. He is cute for anybody out there who can't see him. He's a good-looking guy, Mr. Media.
Hey folks, you can hear Mr. Media while on the go now with Stitcher Smart Radio. Stitcher is a free news and talk mobile app available for your smartphone, whether you use an iPhone, iPod Touch, Android, BlackBerry Curve, or Palm Pre. And when you download Stitcher to hear Mr. Media today, you have a chance to win some real money. Downloading is quick and easy. Just find Stitcher in your smartphone's app store. Download it, it's free, takes seconds. Then, during registration, hit the promo code box and enter Mr. Media, that's MR Media, to get automatically entered to win $100. The latest episode of Mr. Media will be waiting for you in Stitcher's favorites right on your phone. You'll get access to lots of other amazing shows too, always available to you on demand, no syncing. Some of my favorites include WTF with Mark Maron, Plus One Per Diem with Kevin Smith, and The Nerdist with Chris Hardwick. It's all free and all instant to you on Stitcher Smart Radio. And don't forget to win the money. Enter promo code Mr. Media, MR Media, when you register. And thanks for listening.